Hello everyone, Hayden VK-7HH here for Ham Radio DX, and in this video I will be covering an update from the Australian Communications and Media Authority, the ACMA, the organisation which governs amateur radio here in Australia, on their review of non-assigned amateur regulatory arrangements. So you may have watched my video a few days ago dealing with an email from the ACMA that responded to some questions of mine. In that email they alluded to this review coming out in February. It has come out today, the 3rd of February. So I just thought I'd do a quick summary video on exactly what they're proposing, what the changes are that they are looking to implement, and how it affects the amateurs here in Australia. So stick around and I'll try to do my best to explain this. It can get quite complicated. Okay, so what are these changes? Well, the ACMA have released an email bulletin which says, "Have your say, review of non-assigned amateur regulatory arrangements." The ACMA has reviewed the regulatory arrangements that authorise the operation of non-assigned amateur stations. So when we talk about non-assigned amateur stations currently in Australia are under an apparatus licence, which covers assigned, so such assignments are repeaters, beacon stations, which are assigned frequencies which they can transmit and receive on, and non-assigned users or non-assigned licenses who share frequencies with other users, so that's the difference there. It goes on to continue, this work was part of a broader review that included non-assigned outpost licensing arrangements as foreshadowed in the 5-year Spectrum Outlook 2020 to 2024, and there's a link to that which I will pop in the description below. The objective of our review is to identify the best licensing mechanism that reduces regulatory burden and minimise costs for licensees, while also preserving the current operational utility for licensees. We have identified a set of options. We could keep the existing apparatus licensing arrangement and conditions, simplify the existing licensing arrangement and conditions, transition non-assigned stations to class licensing arrangements while retaining apparatus licensing arrangements for assigned stations. So in particular, that last one, assigning assigned stations to a class licensing system, has generated a little bit of debate here in Australia, and I'll be interested to know your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think to this change? And I will cover that in this video for those who are not aware of what that change entails. ACMA continues, "We are now consulting on these options and our preferred approach to authorise the operation of non-assigned amateur stations using a class licence. We are also seeking preliminary comments on a proposal to establish an additional kind of accreditation to allow people to become accredited persons to issue frequency assignment certificates for assigned amateur, repeater and beacon licenses." So here in Australia at the moment, for repeater and beacon licenses, they require a frequency assigner to look over the information that's provided to make sure all the frequencies are not going to interfere with other users on the particular place that they want to assign that license. And once that has passed the frequency assigner, it then gets assigned to the ACMA, who then approve the license. So what they're talking about here is they are looking to establish a easier way of allowing that to happen, because generally this can take a long time and also cost a lot of money too. The consultation paper and draft class license are available on our website. Again, I'll put a link in the description to that. A separate consultation paper and draft instrument relating to outpost licensing is also available. We invite comments on the issues discussed in the consultation papers and on the proposed instruments that would implement our preferred class licensing option. Submission closes on the 2nd of April 2021. Now they've got some information here on how you can make a submission. I encourage all amateurs to read through the information that the ACMA has provided on this issue and to make a submission on it to them, because as they say, they are giving us the opportunity to have a voice on these issues. This particular move to class licensing that the ACMA prefer, it sounds like they're really trying to push it, which can be good, can be bad. There's a bit of debate in the amateur community whether that's going to help, and hopefully I can cover a little bit of that today as to why it's controversial. So currently in Australia, we as amateurs are generally under a non-assigned apparatus license. So as I explained before, that means that we share frequencies, in other words, amateur frequencies with other amateur users. And as part of that, we pay a fee per year, or an annual fee per year to the ACMA for that privilege. In return, we receive some protection for interference to our service, and it's been that way for quite a long time. In fact, the information on the ACMA's website goes on to say that other such users or other such apparatus licenses are giving, say, to aeronautical licenses for stations that communicate with aircraft, land mobile licenses, so other fixed commercial mobile-to-mobile transmitters or fixed-to-mobile transmitters, maritime coast licenses, and public telecommunication services. So all sorts of different license classes there are covered under apparatus license. So they all fall under this apparatus license model. As I said, annually amateurs have to pay a license fee, which does vary up and down. I think at the moment it's around about $59, $60 Australian. Most of that is tax. I think it's a $4 license and about a $55 fee in tax. Don't ask me why they tax it so high when the license is so small, but that's what we pay per year here in Australia, and that affords us certain privileges. So what the ACMA are proposing is moving to a class license system. Now, a class license system basically lets you operate common radio equipment on shared frequencies, is what the ACMA say. Currently, there are 15 class licenses. They're all detailed on the ACMA's website, but they are such things as CB radio or UHF CB radio, body scanners, aircraft and aeronautical mobile stations, LIPD, low interference potential devices, all sorts of things. So they want to move amateurs to a class license. Now, why do the ACMA want to do this? Well, according to the ACMA, the Australian government recently announced its renewed deregulation agenda, and one of the objectives of the deregulation agenda was to identify and remove requirements in regulation that are unnecessary, impose costs in excess of benefits, are hard to find or understand, and are slow and costly to navigate. The ACMA's review of non-assigned amateur licensing arrangements is consistent with the Australian government's deregulation agenda. So the ACMA here are putting this forward because they basically want to identify these costs and these burdens and try and make things simpler, cheaper and easier. So the three options, as I said, that the ACMA have put forward. Option A is to keep existing apparatus licensing arrangements and conditions the same, the status quo, don't touch it. If it's not broken, don't fix it, is a common thing that I've heard before. Option B, simplify existing licensing arrangements and licensing conditions. So that is keeping the same license model with apparatus licensing, but making a few small changes here and there to make things simpler and maybe cheaper. There's not a lot of information on that. And option C, which is the ACMA's preferred option, is transitioning non-assigned amateur stations, so that's pretty much any amateur station that's not a repeater or a beacon station, to class licensing arrangements, while retaining apparatus licensing arrangements for assigned amateur beacon and repeater stations. So let's talk about class licensing and the changes that means for amateurs around Australia. Okay, so this is the summary of the changes that the ACMA have put forward. Now I'm going to go through one by one, and you can view all of this information on the ACMA's website below in the description. So the summary of changes: they would like to introduce an amateur class license that will authorise the operation of amateur stations by people holding relevant foundation, standard or advanced level qualifications, as well as people holding overseas equivalent qualifications or licenses when visiting Australia. They would like to revoke the amateur LCD and include special conditions in individual assigned amateur licenses issued to authorise the operation of amateur repeater and beacon stations. These special conditions will streamline the current regulatory requirements. They would like to simplify the language and streamline conditions applying to the operation of amateur stations in the class license. They would like to develop an amateur operating procedures document to reflect non-mandatory conditions proposed to be removed from the amateur LCD and overseas class license, with a view that these procedures could be managed by the amateur community in the future. The assignment of call signs will be managed by a third-party provider. Amateur operators authorised by the proposed class license will no longer be required to apply for apparatus licenses and therefore will not pay the charges and taxes associated with the issue or renewal of amateur licenses. That is probably the biggest change in this move to class licensing, or one of the biggest, I should say. It's actually probably one of two. That is that amateurs will no longer have to pay an annual fee per year for their license. So once you pass your exam and pay the initial fees for that, you will no longer need to pay an additional fee per year to receive or to continue to have and hold an amateur license. However, there are some drawbacks, and I'll go into those further down. The ACMA's administrative costs relating to the issue and renewal of amateur apparatus licenses for amateurs with foundation, standard or advanced level qualifications will be reduced, so that's a win for the ACMA. And regulatory efficiencies for the ACMA in consolidating the overseas class license and the amateur LCD into the proposed amateur class license, and the revocation of the amateur LCD and overseas class license. So that's a lot of information to take in. That's just a summary. However, let's have a look and see and boil this down and see what exactly the changes are for amateurs in Australia and how it affects them. Okay, so the main differences between the two, apparatus and class licensing, is that apparatus licensing relies, as the ACMA says, on individual licenses being issued to people before operation, which enables greater regulatory oversight of licenses. The ACMA do not consider such an oversight to be necessary for users of non-assigned amateur stations, given the approach to managing the risk of interference will remain effectively unchanged. All radio communications transmitters may pose the risk of interference to other devices and services. The assigned apparatus licensing arrangements, amateur, beacon and repeater stations are assigned a specific frequency to manage the risk of interference that other spectrum users may pose to those services. So what they're saying here is that amateur repeaters and beacons are already not going to be changed. They're probably the most likely to interfere with or be interfered with, being on radio communication sites dotted all around Australia, compared to normal amateur radio operators who may be just operating from home or portable. Amateur stations authorised under the proposed class licensing arrangements would allow amateur users to operate on a no interference, no protection basis that is typical of class license arrangements. This means that a person is authorised to operate an amateur station under the class license on the condition that it does not cause interference to other devices and services, and will generally not be afforded any protection should it experience interference. Now, I just want to point out the wording in this document. The wording says, and will generally not be afforded any protection. So that's not saying that the ACMA will not act on interference that is happening to an amateur station. So basically what they're saying is that an amateur station should not cause interference and it cannot be interfered with. Now, it's debatable whether the current apparatus license affords the same level of protection because, as we know, part of the regulations is that amateurs cannot cause interference to other services, so that part you can probably say is irrelevant. However, being interfered with, as an amateur in Australia, you do have the right at the moment under an apparatus license to go to the ACMA and complain about an interference problem from another user. So going to class licenses, they're basically saying that you will be under a no interference, no protection policy. So the wording is interesting. It says that they will generally not be afforded any protection. That is a little bit ambiguous. I'm not sure whether the ACMA do plan on having some sort of process to deal with interference, but you can probably say that if an interference issue did pop up, that the ACMA wouldn't be interested in amateurs' complaints. That said, under apparatus licensing, I'm not exactly sure that the ACMA are interested in amateurs at the moment, even though they have to, by their own definition of the license, they have to look into any interference complaints by amateurs. Myself, I haven't heard of many times where the ACMA have acted on behalf of the amateur community. I can think of when broadband was being delivered many years ago over the power lines. The ACMA were very much involved in that. That also had the potential to interfere with other users as well. However, if you have had a positive experience with the ACMA or indeed a negative one, please pop that in the comments below. I'd like to hear from you, and if you've had any if you've had any issues with interference and if it's been resolved by the ACMA, so please definitely let me know. So the ACMA also continues, non-assigned amateur licensees currently operate on shared frequencies and are similarly afforded no protection from interference. Our view is that in transitioning to class licensing, managing the risk of interference will remain largely unchanged from the current arrangements. So basically what the ACMA are saying here is that amateurs, because we all operate on shared frequencies with other amateurs, that we can work it out amongst ourselves when we're interfering with one another. So take an example, if you, unfortunately this does happen sometimes, we get a malicious amateur radio operator who is transmitting over somebody else and is causing interference, is just being a general nuisance. The ACMA is basically saying that they will not act on that. It's just basically it's up to you to deal with it and move to another frequency. So basically they're saying that because we're on shared frequencies, we're not offered any protection from interference, so therefore we don't need to worry about the risk of interference, and changing and transitioning to class licenses is low. So that's pretty much what the debate is here in Australia at the moment, is whether this is going to affect amateurs for the negative because of the fact that this no protection policy would come in. The other thing that they would like to do under class licenses is simplify license conditions. So the amateur LCD in Australia can be quite convoluted and complicated to try and navigate around. The draft on the ACMA's website in relation to the move to class licenses does make things a lot simpler. It is only, the draft, if I have a look here, is only 28 pages long. I think the LCD is much longer than that, and it breaks it down quite easily. One thing that did stand out for me, however, in the draft for the class licenses was a part on page 8, 13, operation, additional restrictions on operation in certain frequency bands. Part A says, a person must not operate an amateur station on a frequency within the frequency band 50 MHz to 52 MHz if its operation causes interference to any transmitter operated under an apparatus license or spectrum license authorised to operate in that band. That's an interesting one. Historically in Australia, 50 MHz, we used to have channel 0 analog television. I think channel 1 maybe as well, used to slot into our amateur allocation of 6 meters. I think that amateurs in Australia are still secondary users for that band. They're not primary users. I believe they're primary users from 52 to 54, but not 50 to 52. And this is where a lot of the debate of whether standard licensees should be allowed the whole of 6 meters and advance the whole of 6 meters. The fact that they've added this in the draft is quite interesting. I don't really see the relevance or the point, because there aren't that, as far as I know, there aren't that many transmitters in that frequency band. And also they say they cause interference to any other transmitter. So I'm assuming that if your 6 meter transmitter mixes with another transmitter and causes interference to another service, then you cannot operate it. But I would think that applies for every single amateur band, not just the 6 meter one. So that's an interesting comment that I saw below. Everything else in the draft pretty much remains unchanged. Foundation licensees still restricted to 10 watts and the bands that they are allowed. Standard still 100 watts PX and 30 watts PY. And for advanced licensees, 400 watts PX and 120 watts PY. So no frequency changes, no power changes, nothing else really. That's probably a separate issue to what the ACMA would like to look at. Probably they're not interested at this time. However, the fact that they are allowing amateurs a voice and allowing us to make submissions on these matters probably looks favourable towards getting additional bands, getting additional power in the future. So obviously the changes to class licensing means that amateurs do not have to pay for the license costs anymore. The fees and taxes are removed. Whether that means that amateurs are viewed in a lesser light as less important, I'm not too sure. I think that the ACMA are really trying to make these changes for the better of the hobby. I believe that the ACMA are also trying to make these changes for the better of the ACMA as well. And I think that they've also put a lot of thought into it. The fact that they have proposed this information and given quite a bit of information here to amateurs and allowed us to have our say on these submissions is a good one, so I applaud the ACMA on that. I don't think that they're lowering amateurs to CB standard, so one of the comments that I have seen in regards to moving to class licenses is the fact that amateurs will share a class license category with CB. I don't think that means that amateurs or is derogatory towards amateurs. I don't think that they're putting them down at the same level as CBs. I think that they're two different services completely. Obviously, one requires specific qualifications and the other one doesn't. So I think that that comment is irrelevant. But the ACMA, I think, are really trying to push this class licensing change through. But again, I look forward to hear your comments below. Please let me know below what you think of these changes and what you would like to see done. So that's about all on this topic from the Australian Communications and Media Authority. Again, I appeal to all amateurs around VK to make a submission on this particular issue. You have until, I think the 2nd of April 2021. So make sure that you make a submission. All the information is in the description below and on the ACMA's website. Sign up to their e-bulletin as well to get email alerts on changes to the amateur service in Australia. And yeah, please let me know your thoughts in the comments below on what you would like to see done. I'll also make a note that Peter, VK3YE, on his channel, he has made an excellent video summarising these changes, probably much better than what I've done today. Hopefully you've understood some of the changes. I've basically just done the news and read through some of the relevant bits of information. But Peter also goes into a little bit of history on his channel, so I'll put a link in the cards in the description below as well to his video that he's done. So that's all from me, Hayden, VK7HH here at Ham Radio DX. 73 for now, and I'll see you in the next video.